one of the ways I've been connecting with your work recently is through the framing of Anthro-Complexity. And that seems to be a good way to open up to your perspective and thought in general. So could you share what Anthro-Complexity means?
I've been involved in that over a series of blog posts, and I came up with the term actually in Melbourne, was where I first coined it, almost 2 decades ago, because we were trying to distinguish what we did from what I call computational complexity. So that's a simulation modeling that is associated with Santa Fe, which is what most people think of as complexity science. And we wanted to say it's not that human beings aren't part of nature, we're embedded in it, but we're distinguished in nature, to go back to Bates and the differences which make a difference. Yeah, by intelligence, we have the ability to reflect at a meta level on what's going on in our lives. Maybe other species with symbolic languages like octopi and orangutan do, but those are the only ones with symbolic languages. So let's not be too exclusive. We also shift identities without thinking about it. We learn to work in different social groups. Yeah, a Deme works very differently from a hunting group and so on in Neolithic times. And finally, we have this ability to do things intentionally, even if they don't make immediate sense. So humans are the only species, for example, to sacrifice outside a kinship group, including sacrifice to an idea. So he said, and I famously summed it up in a phrase, human beings are not termites or ants. You can't basically have a single agent and actually create rules and do mass simulation. Now, that doesn't mean simulation aren't useful. Yeah. I've just been going back to Harry Seldon's Foundation as sort of car time reading on audiobooks. And the whole point about psychodynamics is it doesn't work for individuals. It works for very large numbers. So if you look at Forrester's work on economic simulation, he's much more effective than models. So the big thing Santa Fe did is they moved from the sort of modeling concept, which you see in systems dynamics, into simulation. And you see that particularly in the move from neoclassical economics to complexity-based economics. Because the great insight of Santa Fe is that you can't model a complex system because you can never know all the variables. And therefore, economics is not about producing a model and saying what was accurate. It was in the past. It's about simulation to see what patterns are forming, what we call regularities or propensities in a complex system, and work forward. So that stuff is hugely valuable. It was a shift, but our argument was kind of like human beings are different. And then we have the opposition to the psychodynamic history in complexity, which is people like Ralph Stacey, yeah, and which came out of the Tavistock School, which really is a sort of phenomenological association, not a hard science association. So it builds on that psychological tradition, yeah, of the individual, the primacy of the individual change in attitudes. And interesting, the Stacey matrix, even though he later rejected it, really defines complexity by how people feel about a system, not by how a system is. So kind of like we were always sort of halfway house between those two schools, right? And then the third school, which I've just written about and posted on today, is the cybernetics school, in which, by the way, I do not include Bateson. I think Bateson used the term cybernetics, but I put Bateson firmly in the complexity science tradition, not the systems thinking tradition. His disputes with Ashby at the Macy conference were foundational. And what you see in cybernetics is you see like HSD, which was developed, which really takes cybernetics and adds complexity language with some integrity. Yeah. And particularly you see Boyd's OODA loop, which is now popular. Right? But the point about all of those is they focus effectively on what I call the container, not the landscape. And the big thing that we're now starting to shift on to in Anthro-Complexity is an understanding about substrate that comes from physics, from work on constructor theory and elsewhere. And fundamentally, it's the propensities of the landscape which matters, not the containers within the landscape. And that requires a very different way of thinking. I think, the post I put up this morning, I think is going to engender a lot of controversy from people who actually don't read it properly. Because we're not saying that what we understood in the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s, even the early century was wrong. It was coherent to what we knew at the time, and it inherited from a body of intellectual and practice tradition over a century or so, right? But we've now got new insights. It's like epigenetics transformed evolutionary biology, when we knew that cultural can inherit. So we need to rethink this, and that's the process I'm working through slowly and carefully. And I did it over Christmas by using an estuary as a metaphor as opposed to a river. And the estuary metaphor really works. In fact, I've been building that up since, because it gives me things like salinity measures and everything else. And the point about an estuary, it's a highly complex ecology. It sits on a boundary, a transition between states. And it doesn't try and resolve that boundary, which is what systems thinking is always trying to do, is to resolve boundaries. So it's a really powerful metaphor, and I think it's probably more than that, which I'm working on. And I'm about to publish next week a 5-part blog series which further develops that. But in this time, I'm going to use a body of films or television series to do it. So I've picked up on The Gentleman, which was a really brilliant BBC story, which actually is similar to Peaky Blinders, which is similar to the famous mafia film, The Godfather. And basically what these films do is they romanticize and glorify violence. Yeah, but they create an environment in which you see patterns or think things differently. And I sort of finish that off with a comparison between the Banshees of Innisfree, and which builds on the inheritance of the famous Irish Civil War movie, which I've forgotten the name of. It's whatever, right? In fact, they're in the same period. So what that's also bringing in, which has always been a key aspect of what we've done, is to say that aesthetics is part of human experience, and the ability to use novels, to use films, to use music to create meaning in the world is actually a really important part of our biological heritage and the way we compress meaning into highly complex sentences. So I say this is a process, and I had a major experience in Japan. First time I've been in Japan this January, in that I was taken out for a walk by two friends of mine working with an institute we're publishing together. And we got into an argument on the train, which meant we missed the station and ended up kind of like having to truncate the walk, because the argument was far more interesting than anything else. And it was the argument between the highly socially atomistic psychological tradition and the tradition that I'm now in, which is more communitarian collectivist. It's actually, you see it over history. It's Protestant against Catholic. It's all sorts of things. And that gave me an insight to start to see individuals as points of coalescence in an entanglement of interactions, as a way of resolving that debate between primacy of individual and primacy of the collective. And I blogged on that recently, right? And that sort of led to all sorts of other things. It's that sort of, there's a lovely poem by R.S. Thomas on this, where he says that the trouble is we miss insights. It's small demons, it's called. It's kind of like there's this point, we miss the light illuminating something in the bush, a reference to Moses, because we're obsessed with where we're going. So that was a point for me. So it's still developing. It's been around for 15 years, but it's really starting to come together at the moment.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so relational, ecological.
I think it's interesting. Sorry, I mean, I do this because you use language, and I decide to push back on the language to make a point. So it's not relationship, it's entanglement. Right? And entanglement is a very different concept from relationships. Relationship still has that atomistic perspective. I have a relationship with you. Entanglement means I have multiple entanglements with multiple people, and some of them I don't fully understand. I mean, for example...
Does relational have that same connotation?
No, I don't think it does really. I think it now inherits too much. And I think, so for example, one of the big words I've started to use is perdurability. Now, this is one of the great values of the English language. In fact, we have a saying in Wales, English is too good for the English, they don't deserve it, right? Because they've absorbed so many other language groups that there's this vast unused vocabulary which you can draw on. I mean, Shakespeare brought 700 Welsh words into the English language, right? So perdurability is, I can use the meaning as it's defined in the Oxford English Dictionary, but very few people use it. So I can incorporate resilience, robustness, and anti-fragility into a single concept, right? And that kind of like works. And that's what I'm doing. I say we shouldn't talk about resilience, robustness. Perdurability gives us a different way of thinking about it. Entanglement involves all these psychological hangovers of relationships. Yeah? And this is going with Heidegger, man thinks he's the master of language, but language is the master of man. If we don't change the language of the way we describe our experience, we won't change the way we think, because language becomes a container of meaning, which is instantiated by multiple interactions over time.
Yeah. So I agree with that to a point, only because I think it's also relevant to emphasize the aesthetic, the poetic, the metaphorical, and the different ways that we can use multiple words in a flow of communication in order to paint a picture, paint a moving picture. And so, depending on the degree of sort of trust and looseness, we can also employ in a context of caring about naming things specifically, then, I think we can do both. And I hear what you're saying. I understand the worldview you're communicating. And so that's, valuable.
I think I don't disagree with that. We use multiple words. I think the issue is, and this goes back to Clark and others people work, unless you create anomalies, people don't think differently. It's why, for example, in practical terms, I have a major problem with psychological safety, because it homogenizes cultures to the point where people can't innovate. Yeah. And I've just written about that. One of the recent posts is a reference to a famous Welsh legend, which is entitled "She Wants to Be Flowers."
That was a beautiful piece.
Yeah, we homogenize, right? And homogenization is really dangerous, right? So yes, I think that flow, and I think it's that ability. That's what I enjoy about the conversation in Japan, and the conversations where you meet really interesting people, who are not afraid to have their ideas challenged. That's, by the way, a major problem at the moment. Some people, their identity is so tied up with their ideas, is challenge the ideas even in a mild way, and they come back at you big time, right? Or at least their acolytes do. So it's the ability to suspend judgment while having a debate. And I'm using debate deliberately. It's why I get really annoyed with basically people misappropriating indigenous knowledge into what's a West Coast faux spiritual culture. Because every time I work with indigenous people in Australia, they have ferocious arguments and nobody has a problem with it. But they're being fitted into this sort of faux mystical Californian spiritual tradition. And the only way they get a voice now is to conform with that tradition. So we got a new form of neocolonialism, often actually advertised as decolonizing, but it's creating a new type of colonization in that we have this belief or this view of the world, and we want the indigenous people to give us cultural endorsement, and cultural endorsement becomes cultural appropriation.
Well, certainly one of the things I've noticed in the substrate of we'll go with entanglements then, the social entanglements that I've found myself a part of, is that approaching those contexts that on the face of it seek to bring indigenous perspectives, connect indigenous voices with each other. It is, as you say, there is often an environment of walking on eggshells in a way that prevents the messy, real encounter of being human.
I remember working with Auntie Beryl, who was a brilliant indigenous activist in Broken Hill. And I remember at one point, we built up a relationship. She'd taken me into the desert for a few days and stuff like that. And I said, are you saying this is indigenous knowledge because it really is, or because you want to win the argument? And she spoke better English than I do, but she said, white fella got it right. And this huge grin came on her face, right? And I think what matters in the walking on eggshells really pisses me off, because what matters is authenticity to your own background. So if you meet Maori, for example, you have to talk about your history. They won't talk with you until they explain the history, because they need the context. Yeah. I remember, Beth and I had a discussion with Tyson not so long ago, the Welsh meet Australian Aboriginals. And I told the story of my grandmother, who was, she was the last in our family to speak Welsh. And the English passed a law which said Welsh was an uncivilizing influence on the Welsh, so they decided to eliminate it. So if my grandmother spoke Welsh in school, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck with WN on it for Welsh knot. She then had to teach one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she handed over the knot Whoever or the not at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. And I still remember Tyson saying, shit, when did that happen? And I told him, he said they were doing the same thing to us at the same time. And the same thing in Maori, all right? So the elimination of language and culture, or the appropriation of that language and culture into a sort of false myth structure, is what imperial powers always do. It's why, for example, we're now heavily emphasizing way shaping as a concept, not wayfinding. Wayfinding is a Pacific Island indigenous tradition, which is community-owned over time and place. And you can't just move that into a Western context. It doesn't work. Yeah. Way shaping, on the other hand, does, because it talks about finding the faint pathways and then making them stronger, not finding something which pre-exists or imposing something.
Yeah. And so something else you emphasize, which I also connect to, is orientation. Maybe you could say some things about how you're holding orientation and its importance.
Yeah, that's actually the most important part of Boyd's OODA loop. I mean, it's, you've got to observe, orientate, decide, act. Actually, the most critical thing is orientation. And I think we're seeing orientation not just as there's something out there you have to discover, but you're part of what is out there. Therefore, you can shape it. That's the way shaping concept. So orientation is an entanglement with reality. It's not a separation from reality. And that's where, and I'm just going through proofreading on a book chapter, for a big book which is coming out on coaching. And the book title of it is The Pelagian Turn in Coaching. Because I've gone back to a theological debate between Augustine and Pelagius, which to me is far more important than people realize, because Augustine is a very rich, young, privileged man who has a lot of fun with sex, wine, and probably drugs, and adopts Manichaeism, which has informed Western society ever since. And Manichaeism I find evil, all right? And he then, as he gets older, decides to become religious, become a bishop, and tell everybody else not to do what he did when he was young, all right? I mean, the guy's a total hypocrite. And interestingly, Calvin picks up off Augustine. In fact, there's a saying that Calvin takes the worst of Augustine, Augustine takes the worst of St. Paul, and St. Paul corrupts Christ into the Roman Empire, which is a wonderful point. Manda Scott, if you haven't read the books on Roman life, she actually has Paulus as an evil Roman trying to corrupt early Christianity into imperial form, and I actually think she's right. Now, at the same time as Augustine comes along and we get grace and everything is God, it's the authority figure. You have to come to the authority, grace, and in Calvin, it becomes sola fide, justified by faith alone. Yeah. Whereas in the Catholic tradition, more commonly, you're justified by works as well. Pelagius is a Celtic monk. He's a small, innocent guy. He's not politically astute. He's come from a rural background. And he says, basically, God's put man on earth in order to deal with life. And we got free will, and we just got to get on with it. Which to me is eminently practical, right? And that links in with a big difference between the Synod of Whitby. The Celtic churches were dissolved. The Celtic churches were elected abbots. They weren't primogeniture. They were elected by their fellows, working in close relationship with local chiefs and tribes in a sustainable substrate. What happens at Whitby is that is abandoned in favor of bishops and kings. Yeah? So I'm now making this point about the Augustine tradition, which has come over into psychotherapy as well and into the New Age cults, which is you have to discover yourself. I will aid you on the pathway to discovery. It's the problem with step theories. It's all Augustinian. It's all about handing over your authority to somebody else. And we need a much more Pelagian context, which is kind of like where I'm coming from on orientation. Orientation is not about, there isn't a right way of thinking about this. There is a right way of doing things.
A right way of doing things. Could you expand on that more?
Yeah, I think it's, well, I mean, for example, all right, a Pelagian approach is linked in with the stuff we do in distributed ethnography. So we don't want to have workshops where we listen to people because that gives too much authority to the facilitator. It always does, no matter how good the facilitator, right? It's the big problem with participative action research as well, because it tends to attract the people who match the cultural expectations of the facilitator. So we instead, for example, and this is a big thing, we're looking for major funding at the moment, is we make ethnography part of a school curriculum. So kids are gathering stories locally from their people. So it's your own people from your own culture, and it's narrative based. And so that's distributed and entangled, and therefore we can orientate ourselves much better because we know the material is authentic. The minute you move into traditional survey techniques, the minute you move into the whole workshop taste approach, which bedevils systems thinking, and by the way, which develops a lot of psychotherapy. So most psychotherapy, most systems thinking is very Augustinian as opposed to Pelagian.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things which is linked to this that you emphasize is that the facilitator, and I know you're not advocating for obviously basic forms of facilitation, but to the degree that someone is meeting someone else in some capacity of authority with some invitation to provide some service, to participate in the co-orientation of perspective, sense-making, activity, right? There is relationship occurring, and they're part of the, I like the language of alchemical mix. They're part of the brew, if we just stay metaphorical. They're not taking a view from nowhere. You're obviously precisely pushing back against the possibility of taking a view from nowhere. And so that's good. That's, I totally agree with that.
But it depends.
There is, okay, let me just say, there was a part of one of the blogs I was reading where you were addressing a critique, and I don't have it in front of me, but was pointing out that taking a perspective that's aligned with Anthro-Complexity, so for instance, you haven't explored these just yet, but you speak about 3 I's of intelligence, identity, and intention, and then also sentience, sapience, and salience. You are engaging in providing frames to help thinking, and there's discriminations being made about what is more helpful and less helpful in order to situate how we make sense together and what activities there are to do. And I'm just wanting to bring into flow the recognition that, what's the right sort of way to say this?
I think, now let me try and help, all right? We don't think we avoid the problem. We don't think we avoid the problem either. Right?
Absolutely. I know you, and that's of course what you say in the article.
But you can shift away from it. So, for example, we started with distributed ethnography by getting young people to gather stories in their communities. But we created an interpretive structure using text as labels. So, whereas in traditional longitudinal research, the researcher has a theory of the field and they tag the data. Here, the theory of the field went into structure and people tag their own data. And that's a major step forward. The next step we're currently making is to shift from text-based labels to semiotics, to symbols. Yeah, at that point, the meaning emerges as people interact with the system. It's not imposed. Yeah, we couldn't do that 10 years ago because people wouldn't accept it. Now they do. So we started to shift in that direction. We know we'll never remove it. If you notice, we do everything in triangles, not binaries. And there's strong reasons for that, right? So I think the problem is that people say, and let me give it a metaphor. So the classic argument of young earth creationists is evolution is a theory. It's been wrong. So our theory is equally valid, right? And that's, what arose out of philosophy of science, and this is Thakard's work, is the idea of coherence. So I know that evolutionary theory is probably wrong, but it's coherent to the facts as we know them. And there's a mechanism by which as new facts come, we can change it. So epigenetics is the classic case. We now know that culture inherits, which the neo-Darwinians thought was impossible. Darwin actually says it must happen, by the way, if you look at his notebooks. So we pursue that path. On the other hand, young earth creationism is incoherent to the facts, so you don't pursue it. So I think this is one of the factors. And one of the points I've made a couple of times now is the ontological base, the system assumptions behind systems thinking, behind cybernetics, behind psychodynamics, behind most of modern psychology, is not that they can't do things, but where they can go is effectively constrained by their ontological assumptions. Yeah? And once you break those, you can start new pathways. So the new pathways are not exempt from the past. They can't be. They're not exempt from control. But you can mitigate and you can actually try and transform. Now, to be honest, part of the problem we did a SenseMaker project with one of the world's largest companies, one of the big brands. And we were looking at the senior management chain to try and understand their attitudes and beliefs. So I was at the main board meeting in the States. And the chairman took one look at the proposal and he said, "Why are we doing this?" And the HR director said, "We want to hear what people think. We're worried about mandates." And he said, "I've already told them what to think. Why do I want to hear what they actually think? And can the project?" And when we got paid. Now, that guy was actually being far more honest than a lot of other people I've met with who find all sorts of reasons not to hear what they don't want to hear. Yeah? And part of the problem I think we got within Anthro-Complexity is there's an underlying honesty to the process. Because if I commission you as a consultant to facilitate a workshop for employee consultation, I know you're dependent on me for your revenue. You want to be invited back. You're not going to allow something to happen which will challenge me. So we know that's the case. We know we'd be subject to that as well. So we changed the process so that possibility isn't there. And I think those are the sort of things we need people starting to think about. It's not how do we create a magical, perfect universe where everything is now right, but it's how do we recognize deficiencies and how do we move forward? But we move forward not by creating social constructs and claims. So this was the debate I had with one person. I mean, in my view, most of systems thinking takes an Augustian position. They assume that they are the independent observer. Now, nobody will accept that. They all say they don't do it. But if all they do is run workshops and write papers, in practice, they're doing it. And this divide between what we say and what we do, is actually another one coming back to my point about, justification by faith or by works. You're validated by what you do as much as what you say. Right? But that
Absolutely.
Protestant inheritance of sole fide really pervades North Atlantic thinking.
Yeah. So there's an interesting, don't know if it's not exactly a paradox, but that's a word that comes to mind when I think about your character and how you advocate for engaging in conversation, and then some of the core thrust of your work, which will emphasize obliquity, will emphasize being very aware of power dynamics and the kinds of things that can confound communities, organizations, people from actually bringing into relationship awareness what is occurring in their context through narrative or what have you. And I mean, of course, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I have a lot of respect for that approach. There is this necessity still that comes through, for instance, in the presence and reality of interacting with you, which requires being able to relate with disagreement and all the kinds of things which could challenge someone, as you're saying, in exactly the way you're attempting to account for in other contexts and in other processes. For instance, not being, invited maybe to engage in the work because the person who's paying you is going to be destabilized in some way, and so now, I know in criticizing the psychodynamic tradition, as you have begun to explicate it, you also recognize the value in that context and what has been learned and all of that. And I appreciate that in your writing. Obviously, you come out sort of guns blazing in terms of making important distinctions. And I, as you've laid it out here, very much agree with that. the reason I'm saying this is because I want to hold that in mind, as well as to deepen an understanding of what you and what we can understand together as substrate. Now, one of the ways that you articulate substrate, you say substrate is the social structures, material artifacts, habitual narratives, trusted institutions, and patterns of encounter that constitute the medium. Now, you've also obviously mentioned physics and what have you, and you could name, in principle, a number of other, you might, I'm just going to reach for the word levels. That's not necessarily how I think, but certainly there's a relevance in pointing out our entanglements in reality through the prism of physics, chemistry, and so on. We can look at these different contexts and recognize them also influencing our substrate. For me today, attention is another one. And I would also say the context, the relational fabric, the channel, the field. I know you like that. I like that term too. The field in which we are interacting right now is a kind of substrate as well that we can treat in various ways. In that way, cultivate a relationship together, because here we are. I'm going to use the word individual, but by individual, I want to actually mean the way you worded it well before. Okay. So there is, in all of this, the reason why I say this, right, is because one of the most interesting things I think I can attempt to ask you and attempt to bring into presence to see if we are seeing similarly, or where you could help me see, maybe where we could help each other see, is actually like the reality that we're actually experiencing. So taking the example of doing ethnographic work. Now, I could think about doing that in my football club or what have you. And you mentioned having worked with sporting contexts, and I can see how to apply that. Yeah, well, and I can see how to apply that, and so I think that's very valuable. Now, in order to be able to do that at my football club or somewhere else where I might not have a relationship, I obviously have to enter into a relationship with human beings at some level and mediate that to some degree. There might be some cultivation of mutual respect that's required, and I'm basically pointing to the different centers of power, of social standing, activity, institutions in society, the political sphere, which have their own dynamics. They are oftentimes, they can be more or less healthy, they can be more or less contorted and toxic. And right now, we are living in a world where tremendous revelations have been brought to light as to the corruption, toxicity, horrendous manipulation of world affairs, sort of associated with the Epstein files and what have you. And in that context, I see also plenty of people within academia, just adjacent to it, sort of seeking funding and money in ways which seem to me to at least suggest that compromise, the kind of compromises which I think are ultimately quite toxic, are often made in order to gain something from, some substrate without bringing it into question. And so, oftentimes when I relate with your work, I recognize sometimes how far away, for instance, working with organizations or governments or already established contexts is. And it feels like somehow necessary to sort of share a little bit more about the substrate which I encounter, which actually mediates a lot more of the entanglements toward vitality or not in the field as I experience it. And so I'm going to stop there. It's just beginning to get some things on the table which feel sort of right to bring into the context.
It's a really important point. So let me start the response with a Sufi story. Right?
Beautiful.
So the Mullah Nasr, and if you have a debate with Sufis, you're only allowed to debate by narrative competition, not by logical argument, which is actually far more demanding and far more fun, right? So the Mullah Nasruddin lives in a city. He's only ever seen pigeons. One day a hawk lands on his windowsill. He looks at it and he says, "You poor bird." So he clips its talons and clips its beak and clips its wings so he looks like a pigeon. He said, "There you are, now you're a real bird." So every time somebody in IBM said, "Can't you make this stuff simpler?" I used to put that story up. I can make it simpler, but it won't be a falcon anymore. It will be a pigeon. Right? Now, this is not a context-free question. And you need to understand, I come from a tradition which is an oral debating tradition. That's the Celtic tradition. In that we argue for ritual's sake for things we don't believe in over the dinner table and in the Eisteddfod, because that's the way you discover things. It's not personal, it's ritualized. Right? And that's an oral tradition which needs some more respect than it gets. We debate it every week from the age of 11, right? I also come from a family tradition in which my daughter has let the side down because for 6 generations before her, every eldest child has been in a police cell for civil disobedience before they were 18. Going back to Welsh Chartists who ended up in Tassie, right? So I was brought up in a radical tradition as if you believe in something, stand up for it, and if you have to sacrifice yourself, you do it. Right? Now, that's a tradition in humans. Yeah, if you look at the history of changes in human society, some people just stood up and weren't prepared to compromise. And without that, the rest of the system couldn't have shifted. Right? So that's one point. I think the other point is how you deal with different people in different contexts. So Max Brasser and I talked about this at length. Max Brasser was, you don't know him, all right, was one of the unaccounted geniuses of the age. He wrote a brilliant book on strategy. He was my mentor, right? He was also Prince Philip's godson, which made life interesting at times, right? But he was a polymath, all right? He had a first class honours in architecture. He'd been an antique dealer. He was now a lecturer in management studies. He was brilliant. Yeah? And one of the things both of our parties brought up, his university, my IBM, said, "Why are you wasting time with these junior students, your senior people?" And we said, well, first of all, we learn something from them. Naive questions teaches you more than anything else. I never understand why academics don't want to teach. Your best idea is teaching because you're interacting with people from different backgrounds, right? But the way you teach an undergraduate student in the field is radically different from the way you treat somebody who stands up as a keynote at a conference and asserts authority. If you do that, you are making yourself fair game. And if you can't take it, you shouldn't do that. Now, the other problem we got, which I raise in the Flowers problem, this is personal experience, is the acolytes are actually the more dangerous people from thought leaders. It's not the thought leaders who are the problem.
Totally.
Yeah. It's the people around it. So identity is like, they're like religious cults, all right? So I think the nature of the debate has to be different in different contexts and how you deal with things. And I mean, we've built a business and a software product and, we don't often have much cash in the bank and sometimes it gets pretty close. Over 20 years without a grant, without salaries, and only done it by selling projects. Right? And that's now getting easier. So complexity is now the thing, all right? So everybody's putting complexity labels on everything. To use a phrase from the Bible, they're effectively putting old wine into new wineskins with all the consequences which will come on that. I mean, in 2 weeks' time, I'm working with NATO on a complexity-based approach to integrated command. Before the Putin invasion of Ukraine, nobody would have thought of that. I've just come back from the Ukraine, where I spent a week, all right? And the immediacy of threat, it's the first time I've ever had to live through an air raid, right? And don't talk about the journey back on the Polish border, right? So fundamentally, the world, and I think this comes back to something I said earlier, the sort of corruption which we see in Epstein was all there. The biggest model to my mind at the moment we should look at is the Tudor court and the corruption around Henry VIII. That's a closer model than the collapse of the Weimar Republic, right? Because we're getting into a world of populists. So this has always been the case. The problem with the current world is that the problems are now existential. They're not something we can get through and start again. And this is one of my big debates, for example, with chaotic systems, with a lot of people in complexity who think you have to become chaotic before you can restore order. And that's a very North Atlantic imperial trope. Yeah. And I say, North Atlantic neocolonialism, I hate the words West and East because it's just not the case. North Atlantic against the rest is a better way of thinking about it, right? There's a North Atlantic trope about chaos. We will help you create order. It's step change. We are at a higher state of enlightenment. We will take you on our pathway. All of those sort of things are now becoming existential in their threat. Yeah. And I say, from our point of view, and I remember I was working with systems thinking back at the turn of the last century, right? So I was involved with some of the work around taking Beer's VSM modeling. I was working with LSE on the pods. I was working with Frank Kern. I was working with Tavistock. And systems thinking then was considered too academic. But then all of a sudden it became the way of doing things. But it popularized itself around business process re-engineering and learning organization, which was probably the two worst things for it to be picked up on. But that's what took off. And that change happened over 2 or 3 years. And that's what we're now seeing with complexity science. So one of the reasons that effectively I'm being more adamant and I'm making more distinctions is as this goes through this turn, we need it to turn in the right way. If it just becomes a homogenization of the old ways of thinking with new language, which is what it could do, that's actually very dangerous. So there is a time to stand up and be counted. There's a time to start to attack people's ideas. If they can't cope with that, they shouldn't be putting them in forwards in the first place. But there are also learning engagement environments. And this is my problem with things like Bourbonerian dialogue at the same. They assume there is only one way of doing things, when there are radically different ways of doing things in different contexts.
Yeah. So you've mentioned this a few times that we've spoken. And so, I hear all of that. You did address a fair bit of what I was bringing into presence. I guess you are advocating for a certain normativity of capacity to be able to interact in a more, if you'll excuse me, the word you had beginning with P, that was anti-fragile, resilient.
Durability.
Perdurability. So you're advocating for perdurability as a capacity of character or being.
Sorry, just pick up on you.
Agree.
More in the Aristotelian sense, as character emerges, it can't be defined. So that's Aristotle's concept of virtue ethics. So perdurability in the sense of interactions from which character will emerge.
Great. Absolutely. I mean, you build muscle through doing things.
That's it.
So of course, all of this for me is I'm right there with you. Of course, I am subtly seeing if it's possible to push into a question, some questions as to how integrous, how much continuity is there between what we might value as an emergent or developed characterological trait. Is that throughout the plurality of substrates. For instance, there's a way you speak about way shaping as creating conditions rather than engineering outcomes. Now, there's a question as to how fundamental, how plural, how deep does that sense of we run? So who are we? Obviously, there's sort of anthro-complexity speaking to the human being, but of course, the human being is also a duration in time at one level. And how fundamental is creativity, nature, God, and I'm using all of those to point towards something there, obviously, depending on what philosophy you'd like to use the language of. all of those terms have been used in ways that have some overlap, and I'm just wanting to be open at this point. And so the question is, when it comes to orientation, even as necessarily something which is part of our mediation of our entangling, right? It's part of our mediation of relationship. What is that, and like, what is it to be attracted? What is it to feel resonance? These sorts of things. Now, I'm not trying to make a concrete point here just yet, and I know there's quite a bit of theory you'd want to share in relation. So please.
Okay, so this is why I enjoy talking with you, all right? So let's look at this, all right? We're in a point where we face existential threats as a planet, let alone as a species, yeah? We're in a point where a dominant trope or an assemblage or an attractor, which is North Atlantic thinking, which comes from two primary sources. One is the Reformation, which creates the cult of the individual. And the second is the Enlightenment, which creates the cult of rational thinking, the right information, you'll make the right decisions. Yeah. Now that kind of like isn't working anymore.
Totally.
And I don't think there's much difference between the populist exploitation of that and, let's say, the sort of attempt to focus on the individual and the inner self. In fact, I think the whole inner-outer divide is fundamentally in error, right? Because it leads to this emphasis. So we got three main dangers, and I'll talk about what we can do in practice in a minute. So one is appropriation. So people are taking ideas from, and remember, we're taking a natural science base on this. Yeah, we're coming from cognitive neuroscience, we're coming from evolutionary biology, we're coming from complexity science. This isn't a social science ideological construct. It's constrained by common knowledge, which we've arrived scientifically. And that's really important for scalability, right? So one danger is that gets appropriated. So systems thinking, everybody's now talking about complexity theory, right? The whole Jungian, Freudian coaching inheritance, whether it's Lacanian or not, is talking about complexity theory. So the danger there is appropriation, is people assuming the language, but not actually changing. The second is distraction. This is the problem with inner development goals and step theory, is it's lotus eating. It moves people into a place where we can have conversations with people we feel comfortable about, and then we avoid engagement in the world. Yeah, and that's, to me, a major danger. As you know, Nora Bateson has called it out as eugenic. I've called it out as lotus eating, and I've had to explain Homer to people, which depresses me a bit. And the third, which is a real danger, is destruction. This stuff is too dangerous. It might get destroyed. Right? So we got to balance those tensions in the way we do the system. But then the practice becomes important. Instead of taking the North Atlantic norm, which is declare how things should be and tell other people why you're right and they're wrong, that's the inheritance of Manichaeism. Once you understand the theory, you change the micro-level interactions at scale and see what emerges. So, for example, we wouldn't focus on inner change, but what we do in, let's take the Children Project. Yeah, children are gathering stories. The stories show mathematical patterns. Somebody in power, because you have to recognize that power is there, can say, well, I'd like more stories like these and fewer stories like those. And that's actually by way of very different theory of change. It's not talking about qualities. It's saying, I want more micro experiences like these and fewer like those. And at that level of granularity, it's very rarely controversial. It gets controversial when it gets coarsely grained. And then we put together trios. So we put teenager together with person who's retired, together with somebody in local authority. And we run multiple ones of those trios to see what ideas they can come up with. All right. We're not having a workshop where and there's something else we're working on, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is even more important. So we're using transgenerational pairs, and there's science behind that in terms of brain plasticity. We're linking transgenerational insights with people in power at a finely grained level. We're allowing new patterns of interaction to emerge, and what that will create new regularities which can be sustained. So at no stage are we saying this is how the world should be, but we're saying we can start to initiate actions which will change how the world is and open up new possibilities. Yeah, and that includes debate and everything else, right? So that to me is key. The other big thing we're doing at the moment, and this is part of the wider funding project we're looking at, is we need to find a way in which if people, because resources are scarce, all right? So if you have to ask somebody for money, and this is a point you raised very eloquently earlier, this person is in power, I'm going to have to say something to them which they already believe in if I'm going to be given money to do something. Yeah? So we're looking at how we can break that, because to be quite honest, if you get up to C-level in companies, it's not that they want to do that. It's just the only way they know. They know that they're missing opportunities. Out there are ideas which they're not listening to. And you can argue this in terms of entrepreneurship, right? So what we've just been finished developing, which we're about to push out into the market, is you basically say, if you can assemble a group of people with these backgrounds, and we do simulation days to work out what they should be. And I'll give you 2 examples in a second. So you assemble people in a group of, say, 6 roles, and this is the maximum you can go for. You have to go for 4 or 6. Yeah, there's biological reasons behind this. If these 6 roles agree, and a 7th role is completely anonymous, so nobody knows who that person is, and it might be a committee, it might be AI, it might be anything. This is called a panopticon effect. If the 7 of you agree, you can spend $1,000, $10,000 without asking permission. Right? Provided you record why you did it, what you did, and what happened. Now that allows me to effectively use the whole of a workforce or the whole of a country in micro experiments based on mutual interaction. So I will discover things like the Grameen Bank, which come in left field, which I can then amplify. Now that is an example of how we change the substrate. Yeah, we move it from deliberate, intentional, individual action into actually mimicking in many ways the swarming behavior of bees, the predatory behavior of antelopes. We change micro interactions at scale to see what properties will emerge. And then we make decisions about what we find desirable and undesirable. So one of the ones we designed, for example, and this is development sector, if the village priest, the head person, the oldest girl still at school, the youngest boy considered a man, and an anonymous agent from the bank agree, they can spend money. Now that actually is a lot cheaper than traditional requirements. So normally you issue a requirements document. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. You say, we want to fund this sort of projects, but you can only fund projects in very large money because it takes too much to account for it. So you get corruption and everything else. Here you say, well, look, 5% of the budget is available. We'll see what works. The rest of the money will follow that. Okay? Now that's an example of change in the substrate. So patterns can emerge which you wouldn't expect. Yeah? Now that actually is quite attractive to people in power if you get to a very high level, because they know the filtering in middle management means they don't see things they need to see. Right? We're looking at that at the moment for end-of-life decisions for children in hospitals. So difficult, problematic decisions, we didn't evolve to make those decisions as individuals. We're actually very bad in that sense, right? And those are examples of change in the way we think or change in the way we act, right? And that's where we're moving with the whole substrate management, is stop talking about how people should be, stop talking about dialogue, stop talking about discourse. Just change interactions at a micro level and see what comes. Yeah. And there's some really solid science behind that.
Yes. So you're speaking to a particular group of people in saying that, though.
Oh, yes.
Right?
No, absolutely no question. All right. But we've gone from it. I mean, this is market life cycle. We're no longer, though, in early adopters. We're in early majority. And that you have to change your pattern of behavior then. So the ideas are starting to get traction. The early adopter phase is just crazy. We've had that for 20 years, which is normal. You're talking to esoteric people, mavericks, isolated people, but then the market shifts, and it shifts quite quickly. And then you get people who got real intractable problems they need to solve, and they didn't care less how many cases you've got. They want to know you can help them on it. That's called early majority. And that's actually where everything changes, because whatever comes out at the end of that then dominates the next cycle. That's why I'm really concerned about making sure that Anthro-Complexity, not some sort of bastardization of it into old style systems thinking, breaks through at this stage. So you have to understand where you are in the market.
And that's and so could you name that market? So who is this for, basically?
Okay. So community engagement at scale. So development budgets have been slashed. Social enterprise budgets have been slashed. People don't have the money they used to have. So we've got to find a way of doing significantly more with significantly less. Now, an example I gave of where we got young people in the South Wales valleys to actually act as ethnographers, then if they could pair with somebody from their grandparents' generation and local authorities, they could spend a small amount of money. We ended up with about 100 micro projects, which cost the government nothing. which achieve more result than big government grants. So this is where you start to use the substrate to solve problems rather than always trying to solve them problems centrally, which has been the classic, all right? So that's one market, all right? In 2 weeks' time, I'm working with NATO on new methods for command and control. And one of the arguments I've been making in NATO now for 4 years is that it's not just land, sea, air, cyber, and space. It's also civilian. And one of the things Ukraine taught us is civilian resilience is now part of modern warfare. So military people are really interested. Yeah. Innovation in the pharmaceutical sector. So these are the classic early majority buyers, all right? Tends to be military, government, pharmaceutical, and to be honest, oil companies as well. So
right.
The people who want that first mover advantage, but it's also where change starts to happen on a sustainable basis.
Right. You're pointing to already established communities, context, entanglements of relationship.
And everything is evolutionary from where people are. But the big drivers at the moment, all right, for everybody are risk reduction and cost reduction. Now, the good news is actually what we've been working on for the last 20 years is very good at reducing costs and very good at reducing risk. Right? And so that's what you set it off. And that's where you get the traction.
Yes. Well, I can believe all of that. And for what it's worth, I would find it an interesting endeavor to join you in facilitating that, right? So I think it's an interesting project, but I don't live in that. I don't live close to that. I mean, I'm talking with you right now, so that's about as close as I come to that.
Yeah,
right now, the reason I'm saying this is because is it not the case that given the ascendancy of individualism and concordant atomization and all the rest of it, that actually, by and large, as people in the North Atlantic, but elsewhere too, for sure, I mean, we live in fairly disconnected, atomized from contexts of belonging in which maturation, growth of character, all of these things are enabled. And we live in a context in which the core substrates we often engage with, right, are screens, and attention itself is so parasitized that the majority of people relate in a context that doesn't have the cohesion, whether they're pointed in the right direction or not, that you'd find in the military or organizations or what have you. So I'm just trying to locate a little bit of also a lot of the people who will be listening to this and sort of integrating your insight or wanting to integrate it and to apply it.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of things, all right? So one is, let's look at the concept of way shaping. Now, one of the things that the economy is driving at the moment is nobody can afford a mortgage to buy a house as an atomistic couple anymore. So what has happening is people are coming together and buying big houses and not living in a religious community or an ideological community, but just a pragmatic community of people working together and sharing resources, right? That's actually really powerful. My daughter lives in one, and I wish I did as well. That's going back to what's called a Deme, which is a natural group of about sort of 15 to 30, which is actually kind of like a sort of summer tribal hunting party. Yeah, and it means there are people to look after your kids. Your kids don't grow up in environments where I grew up in an extended family, right? My son has just moved back to Newport, which I'm really pleased about, because my granddaughter and my soon-to-be grandson will grow up in an extended family where they'll never quite know which house they're in every night and who the relatives are, right? So those sort of things exist, but economic power is driving it. Now, you can now do something intelligent. So Singapore, for example, in their housing estates are building old people's homes around the food courts in housing blocks which have people within the same income group, so the housing associates. So they're creating a physical artifact. This is actor network theory. They're creating a substrate in which people come together in different bases. And they also know, Singapore knows, that they'll have to have everybody within air conditioning fairly soon, otherwise the whole population will die. I mean, just to really depress you, we know 30 to 50 million people will die one day sometime in the next decade. somewhere in the world, right? Because the temperature will go above 58 degrees. At that point, you die. Right now, we should be getting ready to react to that when it happens, because it's going to change the way the human race thinks about itself. And it won't happen by kumbaya workshops, by middle-class people in Stockholm. It will come by really thinking radically about this and having sensor networks in place to understand how we can influence it. So that's an example of one change which is going on, right? I gave you the example of insufficient money to handle social care. If you look at triage in hospitals, if I understand local community attitudes, then I can potentially discharge people 2 days earlier in some communities than I can, say, in an inner city community. Because I know they'll be lucky. That saves a fortune. Yeah. So complexity is starting to offer different ways of working, which actually reduce cost and reduce risk. And you can see the pressures coming for that in terms of the way it works. So that to me is key. And there's a time where the old way of thinking starts to break and a new way of thinking starts to come through. Now, you've also got a problem here in that we got a lost generation on AI. So we know that, for example, language development, the brain is no longer optimized from it by about 5 or 6, which is why those of us who are dyslexic, and I had a nightmare because my mother, who spoke 4 languages fluently, was told only to speak to us in one language, which was exactly the wrong mistake, because after 5, a dyslexic can't learn language. I can't pronounce text. I can't pronounce words from text. I have to have somebody tell me what they are and lock them into my brain, right? But we also know that cognitive development is optimized up until about late teens. So we got a generation who haven't had the cognitive stimulus that they need. And that's a lost generation that we can't recover. Now, this is a real issue. We're looking at things like I've just talked about earlier, about getting young people to work with old people together with people in middle age. I starting to get over that deficiency by linking and connecting people. So the prime unit of action is a collective, not an individual. And that's really pragmatic in terms of achieving change and auditability. So the chronic individualism of the Reformation is starting to break because it doesn't work. And something new will emerge from it. But we shouldn't decide what that is. But if we change the interactions, we can help its direction of travel. And that's what way shaping is about. We can see these emergent patterns. So why, for example, doesn't governments, instead of building new houses designed for two adults and 2 children, why don't they start to build shared collective entities for younger people and start to integrate old people's homes into it? Because old people with young people, these are classic combinations. So it wouldn't take much to magnify that, and that could be done experimentally. So I think the space is there now to change. My worry is, have we got time to change as a species?
Yeah, so I think those are all interesting ideas. You used a word that in describing, people who maybe similar socioeconomic living together, you said it's like a...
Oh, it's called a Deme.
So Deme, D-E-M-E, is that?
Well, so the primary groups that we evolved from Neolithic times, all right? And there's a lesson in this. One is you've got the sort of binary pair, which wasn't necessarily male-female, but that's the primary nurture group. Yeah. You've got a Deme, which is effectively a collection of families, normally about 20 in total number. And they sort of live together and hunt together. And then you've got what's called a macro Deme. Yeah. And the macro Deme is where all of those come together in winter to survive. And this is Gerber's work, the idea that monument building, people have to come together in winter. They can compete in summer. So it's like, capitalism works in summer, socialism is needed in winter. Right? And the only way you get them to cooperate is to have the priests get them to lug big stones around in the field and create monuments. So monument building is a way of holding people together so they cooperate. Yeah. So and these patterns influence our evolutionary history considerably. So a Deme is kind of like a natural group of families living together, working together, sharing resources. And the ability to become a macro Deme then also becomes important. Yeah.
Right. Well, so you use the term priest there. In other contexts, shaman is often used in the context of this project, right? Now, one of the themes which has been present in this work over a number of years would look at, so terms like cultural shamanism from the perspective of understanding, exploring some of those patterns of how, as you've just articulated, maybe many priests could coordinate so as to support the belonging of a number of Demes. Now, you're not going to like that. Don't get hung up on the language. I'm just trying to point to saying that I
actually think religion is part of what we are as a species. If we don't have priests,
absolutely.
So
well, absolutely. It's just priest, obviously, Catholic. I don't know. See, the thing is that the problem, partly the thing is we live obviously in a very multicultural context where priest is certainly not going to work where I live in North Brunswick, So, but it might work for some,
Well, first of all, the name is not going to be pre-designated, right? So there is one issue on this, which is cultural appropriation, right? So shamanistic practice is an evolved tradition in indigenous communities and elsewhere. And this can get a bit silly. I mean, just to tell you a story, I was a few years ago trepanned. Yeah, so
I don't know.
But I woke up one morning, I couldn't type. All right, I'm male and I'm stupid, so I drove up to North Wales, ran a 3-day workshop. I was sleeping a lot, still couldn't type, couldn't write. Yeah, still went down, ran a 3-day workshop. At the end of it, I was in a bad state, so I went to the doctor, got into hospital. Yeah, all the scans. They said I'd had a stroke. I was depressed. Came home that night with my daughter. We went to the pub. I fortunately didn't take any of the pills. Got back, both slightly drunk, to a message on the answer phone with, get into the nearest hospital as fast as you can and please don't take any of those pills. So daughter drove me drunk to Swindon Hospital and I got an emergency admission to the Radcliffe because I had a massive brain bleed. They checked the scans and if I'd taken those pills, I'd be dead. Right? So either way, the cure for that is they drill 2 holes in your head. You can see the scars if you have a look. And they put staples on it, all right? So all of a sudden, you're bright again. I mean, I was really lucky it manifested because most people just die. So then I lived near Avebury, which is one of the big New Age centres in the UK. So I'm sat outside the pub because I've got to take the bus now. I can't drive. And there's 40 minutes between buses changing at Avebury with massive holes on my head at winter solstice. Yeah. And the whole New Age community is there. So, this is what shaman used to do, is drill 2 holes in the head, all right? So they see the inner eye. So they decide I must have had spiritual experiences. Well, I know Welsh, I'm a storyteller. They want stories, they buy me drinks. So I told them stories. They've now appeared in a book on authentic modern shamanistic experiences, right? So there's a degree of gullibility here, which I find really scary, right? And also, I mean, I come from a Celtic tradition. These are mostly Anglo-Saxons, so I object to the cultural appropriation of Druids, all right? Now, the point I'm making about this is that there's a need for identity, but also there's a need for sensory data. So one of the things I'm working on with some anthropologists, we know that if you look at the way the hordes assembled on the Siberian plains, they assembled faster than the fastest horse can gallop. Now, we now know that pheromones have a massive influence on human sensing. So we think one of the reasons that shaman blinded themselves was that to tune them to pheromones so they could communicate.
Super interesting.
But it's worth remembering the shaman sacrificed. So the whole point about celibacy for the priesthood was it was a sacrifice. Modern shamans don't want to sacrifice. And also, it hasn't evolved within the community. And it's this guidance principle. So let me finish the point, all right? So
sure, of course.
I'm not saying there isn't that role. If you look at the role of priests before the Reformation, they were hedge priests, they were community builders, they evolved. With the Reformation, it became ideological, because now you've got 2 competing branches, all right? So we need to find a way in which a new form will emerge by interactions, which will provide that function, because it always emerges in some form. But it won't be by appropriating another culture's concept.
Well, I mean, absolutely. But also evolution, interaction, adaptation, entanglement, right? So all of that is intermembranic. There's,
Yes. And
that's much deeper than just appropriation. Like, I don't give appropriation, of course, no appropriation.
If you use the word title shaman, you're appropriating something from a tradition you're not part of.
And the same with priest, because I'm not a Catholic and I'm not a Christian.
The point I'm making is neither term can work. That there's a function or a role which exists in human history. It's going to emerge in a different way, and it's probably going to emerge about our identities. But if you change the interaction, those roles will emerge. We shouldn't predefine them.
Well, again, no one's predefining anything here. Like but we are attempting to point to things. I mean, you're using the language of priests. You're saying that shaman can't be the word because that would be appropriation. To me, that looks a little bit like predefining the outcome, right? It's not clear to me because I don't think it's the case that everybody who uses the language of shaman falls under the category that you say. Like, I think lots do, and those are worthy of critiquing. I certainly do myself. I'm not attached to the language. However, to the degree that we're having a conversation, have to use it. So here's the thing. I'm putting my hands back saying cultural shamanism. Like I'm saying something to you, which I know you're going to reject, but it's all I have to communicate to you that I hear you. Here's me translating it into another context. I care about the meaning and staying with the meaning, right? And how can we pay attention to interacting in and supporting the contexts and building trust in the context of cultivating and building and moving towards some of those structures which can help people, help ourselves live with more grace and wisdom and all of that in our time, right? Obviously.
So let's come back to something you said earlier, which is really important, is we live in a world which doesn't accept those sort of concepts. All right. So all you're doing is you're isolating yourself to be ignored. All right. So that's the problem with that sort of thing. You end up now let me finish the point. You end up in a comfortable group, but the people you want to change. My point is I'm using the language of priests and shaman to say this is things which used to exist, but they can't exist again. But there are roles, and it's not individuals, there are roles which will emerge. And so I've given you some examples, starting to put young people with old people with people in power, starting to build different types of community, starting to do things to change the way that people interact and see how those roles manifest in a different age, because they will come through, but differently.
Absolutely. Well, I'm using it to point to the role, so I'm with you. So Layman Pascal uses the term meta shamanism to point to that it's recognizing that you can smirk, right? And I get that, and it's all done tongue in cheek, right?
And grinning wryly, it's different, all right. The minute we use the meta word, we know we're going in a bad pathway, right?
Well, it kind of depends, because if we can actually stay in the process of understanding with each other, then we can all have a beer and have a laugh, right? Because it's just a word in the context of our trusting each other and building that trust. And so obviously I care about understanding what roles and so there's a way of speaking about archetypes, which you've written, which I quite liked. I think I have it here.
They're not Jungian, they're not universal, they're particular. Yeah.
Well, of course not. However, when I mentioned before that this notion of substrate and way shaping as creating conditions rather than engineering outcomes, and the conditions we create, right? There's this emphasis on there's this emphasis on entanglement, and it's not clear to me that we is something which can be reduced to just the duration of human, that there is an entanglement across time, that the modes of orientation that constitute way shaping are constituted throughout biology. And in Whitehead's philosophy of organism, you famously have biology is a study of the larger organisms and physics is a study of the smaller organisms. And there's something important. Pardon?
That is changing a bit.
He reverses it. It's the other way around or something like that.
No, it's physics is now starting to look at the whole, all right? And we're starting to see a fusion of those disciplines. But look, let's take the way shaping thing. The key metaphor I use is a walking metaphor because that's my hobby, all right? And the way you find a way across a marsh is you follow the sheep tracks. The sheep tracks exist, but they're for sheep. And if enough human beings follow the same sheep tracks, then it becomes a path human beings can follow. Then it becomes a path which is so worn we have to put stone on it, so it becomes a track, right? Now, that's the equivalent. What we're trying to do, so there's a residual memory of hedge priests, of shamanistic behavior within the human species. Those are traces that we can follow and use. But the way they're going to manifest is different, right? So we're not in disagreement about the need. We're in disagreement about the process by which that need gets manifested.
The process by which that need gets manifested. How are you seeing what I'm saying the process is by how that need gets manifested, and how are you saying it?
Okay, so I'm being more extreme than I would like to be, just to make a point, all right? Okay. So what you're using the language of old pathways to describe current tracks. And those pathways don't exist anymore. All right? So we need to find new language for new ways of thinking. And that new language will emerge. And it's not just individuals, it's not just humans. I mean, one of the things I was talking about with Tyson last time I was with him in Melbourne Airport, as it happens, was we need to start to think about a peace and reconciliation process with the planet. Yeah, it's not just people, it's peace and reconciliation with the environment. Yeah, so this is also fits in with actor network theory and process philosophy, right? Our big project was started this year. We're looking at about human AI interfaces and what are the boundaries between them. Next year, we're going to look at new forms of democracy, because one person, one vote with 4-year election cycles does not work given the catastrophic threats the species have, right? So that's our big project for next year. Now, all of this is kind of like, we need to explore new territory and not try and have a romantic harking back to a past which no longer exists, right? That in Welsh is called Idith, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's 0% of me that's romanticizing and harkening back, right? So, so far, you've only got that from me using a word.
Yeah, but that's my point.
Really
and words mean things. Words have huge power.
Yeah, of course, but I don't know. They change. They do change and shift over time. I mean,
they can, but you need to look at what is the meaning of the word in current parlance. So, for example, I brought in Welsh words because nobody knows what they mean, right? But it gets people to think differently. So, Cynefin as a word is now really well known, and people talk about it, right? Perdurability, I'm using a word people don't use. I'm not using an old word in a new.
And they probably won't use it.
They may do, they may not. It's an experiment. I'm not saying I've got the solution. I'm saying this is one probe to see if that will bite.
Both are valid, seems to me. Both happen.
I succeeded with Cynefin. I'm starting, I think, to succeed with wave shaping and with estuary, right? But yeah, there's been lots of failed experiments. The point is you've got to do small things and see what works. You can't just decide what the solution is.
Well, absolutely. And again, I'm 0% coming from the place of deciding what the solution is. I mean, it's quite clear that the whole way I approach these conversations is very much in the spirit of opening to perspective.
I wouldn't put you in the category, and I'm not going to name names on this, but I've had bad experiences lately. You have people who have self-appointed themselves as high priestesses, who said they're the shaman of the future. You're not in that category, all right? And very clear from all of our conversations, just to be absolutely clear. But that is now becoming a dominant way of thinking, and you get associated with it. And I think I've had to make stronger distinctions with systems thinking I would like to, because people overlay a current understanding on something new. And I think this is a constant dilemma. I'm not saying we got the answer to it, but it's something everybody has to take account of.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I hear you. I mean, one of the reasons why I've been oriented toward why I care about, why I still am experimenting in process of inviting, supporting contexts for interaction, where communication, right? But where conversation is part of that as humans relating with each other, is so that it's possible to bring to criticality, to bring to aporia, to challenge, but also to open, right? And receive insight in just the kind of way we're speaking about. Like, it seems What do you think? I mean, talk about a question where my identity could be bound up with perspective, right? Because I have been. I don't really like to use the word sacrifice because that does just sound a little bit too religious in the context of self-appointing oneself in some mode of religion. When I've said to you, I don't belong to a named religion, but I'm a human being and I care about people and I'm entangled just as much as anyone who belongs to a religion. And I recognize the importance of religion, right? And so all of that. And so, what language am I entitled to? I mean, speak from the soul, and treat others with integrity. And then I don't know how much I'm willing to bow down to anyone who says I can't use this word or that word if I'm resonating from the core something that's treating things well.
What I'm suggesting is using that word association with things we don't want to be associated with. This is a dialogue, yeah? I'm saying I would not use that word because I know what it gets associated with, and therefore it's too easy for people to dismiss it.
Yeah, but who's dismissing? Who's dismissing?
Well, this is where we get into losing assemblages, all right? So, the narrative patterns start to exist, and they create patterns, and you can't escape them. So one of the points I was trying to make is in the She Wants to Be Flowers, very short blog post, all right? But it took me about 3 weeks to write.
I say again, I really appreciated it. Yeah.
Is that what we've done is, there was an attempt to create an assemblage around a certain type of liberal value, which didn't form before it was imposed. And now you got the pushback against it. You got the Jordan Petersons, you got all these sort of things. And that's the danger, right? You're living in a very fluid environment, and where changes happen, they change very quickly. So this concept that Deleuze has of territorialization and deterritorialization and lines of flight becomes very important for anybody involved in social activism to understand those. And the trouble is, people who get involved in social activism care. So there's an old adage, by the way, this is a British one, but it's generally true, is the right are always cohesive because they don't believe anything. The left are always fragmented because they believe in things too strongly. Yeah. So there's a town in Wales called Bethesda, right? In 1920, I think it had a population of about 10,000. No, actually 7,000. But it had 23 different Protestant chapels and one church. All right. And 3 pubs. Right? Because Protestants believe in things, so they fracture because you have to believe in what they believe. And that was the problem with the left in the States. It's the problem with the left in Australia. It's the problem with the left everywhere else, right? There's the cohesion is articulated and idealistic. It's not a substrate, which is where the far right come from. They tap into these underlying attitudes and beliefs and amplify them. Now, those of us who are progressive have got to think about how to do that, and how to avoid falling into the linguistic traps which are set. It's too easy to dismiss people who think differently by giving them a label. That was my point about containers. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly. So there's another word which I saw that you wrote about, but you only mentioned it. I couldn't find the blog post where you speak about it more as something that you don't like, is the word presence.
Yeah.
Now, I'll often say in conversation, I'm glad we've brought this into presence, right? Now, that seems to me to be not an unhelpful way of attempting to communicate.
Now, my objection to presence is that I think Peter Senge and Otto Scharmerger are just modern forms of neocolonialism. They're trying to impose a white male North Atlantic concept of how things should be on other people, and it hasn't been effective. So I'm objecting to presence in that sense. Okay.
So I just don't even encounter, I don't even encounter. There's no connection for me between presence and that.
Right? So to be present, I'm happy with that language. My attack on presence is an attack on Scharmerger and Senge as being very dangerous. Yeah.
Okay. So now I want to speak to an aspect of presence, which again, I know that you're kind of locked into potentially interpreting it through what you're really strongly resisting. So if you, when I think of presence, I also think of the phenomenology of maybe appreciating someone's resonance, or what it's like to be entangled or in relationship with someone. And there can be a tremendous diversity of those, obviously. Like, I would never think about presence as, the only presence that counts is like a white man's presence. Like, obviously appreciate many different kinds of presence with the world, with animals, with people of all, shapes and sizes. It does also seem to me that there are qualities of presence which can be supportive and maybe constitutive of integrating certain complexities into, at least a whole for that duration. I like the language of whole making, right? So maybe like someone who's experienced a loud bang before and knows that it was just a truck outside, right, rather than a bomb, may in their bearing communicate a presence that others can orient, in relationship with and not panic as much. Right? I don't know, stupid example. But that in the context of, let's say, tribes who might be diverse, maybe haven't encountered each other before. And of course, the role of shamans in various contexts was to be that kind of bridge, right? So it may be where contact can be made that isn't necessarily going to lead to violence. I could imagine there being a quality of presence, a style, a kind of vibration used poetically, a resonance, which prior to language or in addition to language is playing some role in some moment of an interaction to support the possibility of coming into something other than just violent, right?
Completely agree with that. Absolutely okay. No disagreement. And let me give you 3 examples to make the point, all right? So I walk a lot in the mountains on my own, right? And that actually is a form of meditation. Yeah, so I do endurance. So I walk for 8-10 hours, or I cycle for at least 2 or 3 hours. Because you get into a meditative state, you're present in the moment, the physical interaction, you start to think about things, and that's important. The people I value walking with are the people who can walk in silence. No? Because that's a different way of being present, all right? I got some of my best ideas for Cynefin looking at Caravaggio's 7 Mercies in Naples with my daughter, right? And I've just been, as I say, in the Ukraine. The first time the air raid sirens went off, I went down to the air raid shelter. There was nobody there, so I went back up. And the Ukrainians know when it's serious and when it isn't. They have an app which tells them what the warning is about. They know where they live. They know whether they need to bother or not. Yeah, so I just copied their behavior. No? So that I buy. All right. Now, come back to something I said earlier. If you look at the Celtic Church, this is in your cultural tradition more than the shamanistic tradition. Yeah. If you look at that cultural tradition, you had this counterbalance of powers. And this is one of the roles shaman play in other societies. They are the competing source of power with the chief. This was the role the medieval Catholic Church had against kings. Is there were 2 powers with different backgrounds in contradiction. In the Celtic Church, you had the abbot with the chief, and they have to find an accommodation, right? So there are multiple things in our history about that in which that understanding comes. Those are all faint pathways that we need to now weigh shape into something which will sustain the future. Yeah.
Yes. I get you. I'm with you. One of the things which I'm trying to include, and your example of the shamans blinding themselves so as to be more attuned to pheromones is a great example. So, in a previous conversation, we spoke about the risk, the reality of atrophy. Yeah. If artificial intelligence is used inappropriately
and
what have you. We can
point. It's already happened with the whole generation.
Absolutely. And we could say this about different kinds of technologies or, just becoming of different functions. There is a tremendous open question to me, and a mystery, and an exciting. It's exciting. Like what capacities could be not necessarily represenced, but exapted, rediscovered, exapted, evolved, that have previously enabled the kind of attunement to ecology, right? The kind of openness to interaction that would be more associated with way shaping in a much more living, immanent sense, rather than pre-designing, as you're consistently saying, what the outcome should be, in part as coming from a too narrow frame that's also imposing itself on the world. And there's something to me that's quite inspiring in that. Anyway, go ahead.
Let's talk about an example of a project we did on that, which regrettably we managed to work in Canada, but we couldn't replicate it in Australia. So this was just after I left IBM, and I could only run it when I left IBM. IBM couldn't cope with it, right? So we brought together people from industry. We brought 3 groups together, right? People from industry, people with backgrounds in multiple disciplines, physics, chemistry, but also we had a Lutheran liturgical design specialist. It was just anybody I could get from any background, but they were deep specialists. And we brought them together in Saskatoon, and we gave them a full First Nations spiritual experience, drums, smoke, everything else with shaman. Yeah. And that was actually quite interesting because, you know, two of the male members of the audience discovered their spirit animal in their first meditation. Of course, it was a mountain lion. So we marked them off, right? I mean, I know my spirit animal, but I've been doing this for about 20 years, and it's a raven, all right? But it takes time for you to understand what it is, right? What they discovered the next day is a shaman. One was a Nobel Prize winning chemist, and the other was the head surgeon of a doctor, and that shocked the bloody hell out of them. Yeah. So we created a different encounter. We brought things together from multiple backgrounds to create new patterns. Yeah. Now we tried to do the same in Broken Hill, but I couldn't get Australian companies to buy into it. Yeah. But the time may have come for that sort of process again. So it's a bringing together in a different context. So the example I've given a lot is the work I did in the 70s in Ireland. We didn't have a workshop to agree that Catholics and Protestants should be nice to each other and engage in dialogue. That never worked for a sustainable basis. We took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant and vice versa, and we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 3 months. So we changed the context and we changed the granularity, and people had their own conversations. Now that's what we need to do more of. Yeah, we need to bring people together in different contexts from different backgrounds. We don't need to actually mediate the discussion or say what's the discussion they have. We need to put them in a context where they have different discussions. So, for example, Auntie Beryl decided at one point I didn't understand enough, so I got taken into the wilderness, all right? I understood far more about indigenous culture after I spent 3 days with her in the desert. Now, I don't pretend to understand it the way she understood it, but I had that overlap. But it was encounter through working and living together in a different context. It wasn't about talking about the subject overtly. That's a very Enlightenment concept. The Enlightenment concept is we have these, Buberian dialogue. All of these things come from that concept. If we just have a rational dialogue, it will be fine. And it won't. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. So we only have so long, and I feel like there's still so far, I feel like we're only in a similar place to our previous conversations. I sometimes wonder about the limitations of public. I've often expressed this on the podcast. The very fact I've expressed this on the podcast a number of times makes me not want to express it, because I know that's not as interesting to people who listen to the podcast, which is part of the issue. I'm interested in what is possible to speak in the particular mediums that we meet and interact on, which of course is exactly what you're talking about, right? What kind of relationship, what kind of entanglement is it possible to resituate, reorient, grow and build together unless we change the context? Okay.
In the podcast, So, sorry, I mean, one of the things we might want to look at, all right? So I'm probably going to be in Australia later on this year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there is a huge difference between a 90-minute podcast and sitting around a fire chatting over 2 or 3 days with people from different backgrounds, all right? And I think what we're concerned about at the moment, and that this is, I mean, this was the debate we had recently in one country, is you have two groups, people who wanted to have a personal experience and reconnect with the land and with society and just feel good about lives. And those of us who wanted to change the world because we'd had enough and we didn't want to resort into that. That was Lotus. Now, that was an inseparable divide. It got really, really nasty, like very nasty, right? And I think that was because there were too many people. The group was too large. The conversations weren't intimate enough, all right? But I think there is a bringing together of people from different backgrounds who respect the fact that we can't carry on as we are as a species. But it's got to be people from radically different backgrounds, not people who will reinforce their existing beliefs. And it's got to be that sort of encounter. And I think that's what we need more of. Podcasts.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a really useful podcast. I mean, it's useful for me. Hopefully it's useful for you. It's helpful for some people. But you can only influence so many people at any one time.
No, I hear you. I mean, I'm really just I'm expressing the exact kind of frustration that you're reflecting back to me in the example you're giving of, that. But
I have a big advantage over you, all right? Is I know the science of why I can't achieve what I want to achieve in a short time, so I'm more relaxed about it, all right? And I understand that. And this me being quite, you want to change it now, right? I'm basically, this is probably grandparent syndrome. I know it can't change overnight. So how do I create conditions under which it's more likely to change?
Totally. I mean, I'd have a different response for you now off recording. But yeah, no, I'm not someone who's looking for a quick fix or is in that place. That's really never been my orientation. I'm aware of the struggle. The struggle is real. Saying the struggle is real is in fact something that can be a good signal filter for people who really want to engage in the real thing. But from the perspective of cultivating the kind of attentional capital, which I think is particularly necessary to the degree that it's possible to connect with authority and bring them to places of aporia and criticality, right? So we can have a little bit more integrity in discourse to the degree that is relevant at all, which I think it is massively, given so much attention and energy goes into what happens on screens, even though we shouldn't be optimizing for a world that's made up of screens. I totally get that, but here we are. And part of the if you will, meta point I've been trying to make is just that the location, the location in narrative, the location in context, topography that I find myself in is one with a different set of constraints and affordances naturally to that of yours. And so applying some of where you're coming from, it's almost as if I'm kind of wanting to ask you to see where those faint pathways are through contexts that in many ways make absolutely no sense from a theoretical perspective influenced by Cynefin to actually engage in, but are in fact where we are. Space is very difficult to pay for if you want to gather X number of people together, roughly protected enough from the elements in a sufficient amount of comfort to attract them there to begin with. Or if you're going to make discomfort the main thing that's in attracting people, then fine, that's part of it. But too much discomfort and they're not going to come. And there's already quite a bit of discomfort in a certain, kinds of engagement where diversity can actually meet and encounter real difference that people want to back away from anyway. So you kind of got to pick your poison in how much comfort and discomfort, you make up of things.
Let's look at a couple of things. We've actually twice now used a holiday camp near Port Arthur in Tasmania to bring people together from different backgrounds. But we ritualize the encounter. That's what we developed, which is called a triopticon, which is a ritualized encounter between expertise and naivety. And we expose people to the panopticon in Port Arthur and things like that to make them to see what's actually reality. Right, so you can do this, all right? But then look at the difference, all right? So if I the stuff we're doing on Children of the World is it ticks a box in the school curriculum. We're not asking them to do something extra. We're saying, if you take this program on, that thing in the curriculum saves you time as a teacher. That's really important. We're not putting additional burden. We're working obliquely. If I get kids to gather stories, I'm completely changing the substrate, because a politician will pay attention if, say, 10% of the schools in Victoria gathered stories every week for a year, and this is the pattern from those stories. Politicians will pay attention to that. If I say we had a really good workshop and we come up with a new solution for you, they'll ignore it. Yeah. So it's the nature of the intervention which matters, and the scale. I think this is the thing. This is a really difficult thing to get across on complexity. You can't do a pilot project. You have to work with the whole system. Right? And you have to work at scale. But this is us trying to pay attention to how do you change the substrate for the decision makers, is you change the way they entangle with the environment. But they spend too much time with experts and advocates. So if you're an expert or an advocate, you won't be listened to. That's the scary stuff, all right? So you have to change the dynamics of the way they listen.
So changing the dynamics of the way people listen, you know, supporting, attracting a richer receptivity is one of the ways I think about the kinds of events, both online and sort of the conversations in groups, as well as, you know, local gatherings. That's something that seems to be a good idea, right? Mm-hmm. Now, given limitations in activity at scale with the kind of resources to find the perfect environment, different concessions have to be made. Do you think there is value in a network of people caring about the quality of attention they bring to a context so as to enable interaction to traverse territory that it might not ordinarily?
I think there's considerable value in it until it gets to be something like the inner development goals. The inner development goals and that movement is an example of how this goes badly wrong. Because it becomes...
Totally. So can we just leave that there?
Yeah, that's the point I make. So I think there's huge value in it. The value, but there's always that danger in the background. That's what it can slip into quickly.
Yeah, I guess like at some point, we obviously the conversation needs to progress in a way that doesn't just need to make that, you know, because it just hasn't been present with me for this whole time. I've spoken to people who find value in understanding inner development, right? It's not how I meet people and interact. And so, you know, there's a whole vista in going another way. And so it just still seems to me necessary to try and create contexts in which intentional attention can enrich the medium substrate that constitutes the entangled communication, and in that process come to create resonant nodes, not as contained things. I always like to think about integrity in terms of sharing space rather than just holding space. But nevertheless, like intention is put to a place in time. You know, we're not just going to talk for the next 6 hours because we're not round a fire. Those aren't our constraints. The space is sort of held a little bit by the agreements we have and whatever else. But there's a little bleed over. But nevertheless, to create these contexts in which to provide a different frequency, a different kind of something else in this alchemical mixture of this absolutely parasitized and polluted attentional commons full of so much corruption and propaganda and mistreatment. It seems to me that far from conversation being something just to name when it comes up as needing to be critiqued because of the ways it's been mishandled, that actually caring about the rigorous potential of it seems like an absolutely necessary calling in precise response to some of the key technological mediums which mediate our attention, which are so popular today, so common today?
I think it's important. Yeah. I think it can happen. I think it's useful. The issue is the granularity and the context in which it happens. Right? So, and it's also the way you encounter. So, give you an example. When I was working in the States many years ago, I did a couple of months covert ethnography into Tea Party communities. I remember going back to DC and talking to a bunch of Democrats and saying, you guys have got these guys all wrong. They're socialists. When you live with them, everybody looks after everybody else. It's mediated through the church. They just don't see what you're talking about in inner city Chicago. It's a totally different context. But you're labeling them because of their religion and because of their social values as right wing. You will make them extreme right wing if you carry on doing that. Yeah? So I think the sort of conversations you need to talk about, that they're valuable, but they have to take place in the context of integrating with people. Now, personal example. So when I grew up, all right, parents couldn't choose which school you went to. You went to the school in the geographical area you were. So you had to work with people from radically different backgrounds. You learned to talk with them. You learned to engage with them at a young age. Now everybody ends up within culturally clustered schools. So the division is much higher, right? And we saw that with president scholars in Singapore, for example, where we ended up dumping them into development projects in Indonesia for a year or so they could understand things can go wrong. So what we got is this clustering of context in which people talk with people who think like them and they don't talk with people who think differently. And that's the danger. It's not that it isn't important, but it has to take place within a wider encounter type environment, I think.
Yeah, I mean, where are these wider encounter type environments where people...
I don't know. I think we need to devise them, all right? So, I mean, one is we did, when I was very young, all right, is we took middle-class kids and we dumped them onto the streets of London for 2 days with only 10p. And we wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore. But God, they came with a learning out of it, all right? So I think it's my example of the Northern Ireland case. It's micro discussions with people from different backgrounds in different contexts, right? So I think the danger with the discussion of people who come together because they've got a common concern is the diversity issue and the context shift issue. So I think if those groups can find different ways to entangle themselves with different experiences, let me give another example, one which works, all right? So one of the projects we worked on was in Liverpool, where you got a lot of poverty. And so the two football clubs who hate each other's guts, I mean, Liverpool and Everton do not get on. You know, one is in red, the other is in blue. The slogan they came up with is poverty isn't red or blue. So they created a completely novel form of food bank in which you're not given charity. You turn up, you hand over a couple of pounds and you get £30 back in vouchers or £20, I can't remember. And then you go and shop in a market which has been set up with gifted food. And what's interesting is middle-class academics actually man the stalls because they get to meet people and talk with them. So the place, you know, coming back to the concept of place, creates a context for a different type of entanglement. But people are equals because they're not being handed charity by somebody behind a table giving them a box. The person is in the role of the shopkeeper trying to sell them a product and they can choose which product they have. Now, those are the things, and I gave you the Singapore example. We need more cases where people encounter each other in day-to-day living. The point we've made on climate change for years now is until people worry about their village duck pond, politicians will not worry about the planet. Yeah, you've got to create micro concern in order that people see the wider picture.
Yeah. It sometimes feels like as much as you're speaking to actions which, if taken, would be agentic and valuable, that there's also a kind of a bit of a loss of agency that I experience upon hearing it.
Yeah, that's purposeful.
Okay.
That's actually going back to the role of the shaman and the priest. They're not there to handle the politics.
Can you say a little bit more? I'm not 100% following.
I think certainly if you're white, you're male, you come from a Northern Atlantic background, you've got to find ways to give up agency without losing advocacy rights, all right? The ability to speak, the ability to have discussions. I learned more when I was in Kakadu in the 1970s, and this was my first Australian experience. I was working on human rights for the World Council of Churches. And just to be clear, I'm a Catholic convert, and I became a convert because of justification by faith alone. I said, you've got to be justified by work. That was my key trigger point. We can't have this solo fide nonsense. So I'm working on Aboriginal land rights north of Darwin. And one of the Aboriginal activists, when the mine guard shot his head off with a shotgun, and blood spattered all over me. And we went to the police, and they said it's only an abo.
Yes, I've heard you say that story a few times, which is why
changed my
the reaction
life, right?
is.
I then went into Kakadu and just spent time there and understood things. But I had to give up my agency in order to understand something different. Now, it's not that I give up agency permanently, but I create spaces in which I give up agency. And it's like the Japanese have a thing called the gemba, right? They put the manager in a chalk circle and they just have to observe. We need to do much more of that. And the danger is we like to be with other people who think like us. And when we all do that, it's a natural tendency.
Yeah, I don't know if you... I mean, I'm sure you do at one level, but I don't know if you appreciate just how incredibly devoid of agency people have to give up.
I mean, the answer is I would be cautious about saying anything on that, right? As I say, we're coming from a position which says, look, we've got to change interactions at scale. We've got to change the actants, right? And then we got to.
Yeah, but I meet the world here and now.
Yeah, well, we are
locally.
We're talking very practically. We're saying let children be ethnographers. We're saying create food banks where people come together from different backgrounds. What we're doing is...
I love that. I'd like to contribute to that, by the way. If there was a way I knew how, I was going to message you.
You can replicate it. You could have Hawthorne come together with Port Adelaide if you want, because those supporters don't get on very well. They've actually translated it to Glasgow, right? So there are things that we can copy, and we're trying to create... One of the reasons we're also doing with the Children Project is to create narrative databases where ideas can spread horizontally. Yeah. So we're coming from a fundamental principle: change the interactions, change the actants, monitor the results, let energy flow where it's producing results, not where you think the results should be. And we're not perfect, but that's kind of like the design principle.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. There's this way, it's a mode that you often take up in our conversations, and people do tend to take up in general, where in order to make a point, there has to be something to hold it up against as, the other and the different. And there's a value in that, but of course it can miss when that's not necessarily represented in the actual relational context that's present. And as a result, it does feel like there's definitely a certain labor in coming closer towards sharing, sort of, for instance, like who I am and where I am. Is that something that you are aware of?
I think if it came up in context, in discussion, by working together, yes. But as an isolated practice, I think that's very culturally specific. It works for some people, but it won't work at scale.
Yeah, again, the working at scale thing is an interesting one. It seems to me that a lot of and again, because I'm anticipating what the critique might be, which from my perspective doesn't actually land, although has tremendous merit in saying, I'm preventing myself from following through. It seems to me that so much of discourse, communication, online, in culture, is just a war of polemics, which end up just sort of emaciating the richness of what could be a more intimate encounter. That no one can see the perspective of the other side for reasons which I know you understand. And so it does strike me that the artfulness required for real debate is something which, like, obviously so necessary, so important. But the way I see debate happen is generally not artful at all. It's often tremendously manipulative and is kind of disregarding of mutual learning, opening perspective, and particularly manipulating and conditioning of the attentional field that is the substrate that makes the encounter relevant for capital or the attention economy. It just continues to tribalize people. And so I do wonder about whether you give enough, not just credit, but I don't know if you appreciate enough the artfulness required for debate as something to be situated within a much richer suite of modes of communication. And it seems as though in order to promote the value of debate, you often, denounce some other modes of communication. And from my perspective, it's like, it's not needed because all of them belong.
But okay, let's look at this. So, for example, the reason I designed and created the Triopticon, which took 4 years, was to create a ritualized form in which different bodies of practice come together and listen in silence. So everybody gets to speak once and be silent most of the time. An interaction between deep expertise of the expert eagles and the more naive expertise of the ravens, all right? So that's ritualizing a new form of debate. It's way shaping, because I took old practices of academic confrontation and put them together in a way which could handle, right? That worked because ritual does it. I grew up in a debating tradition where you didn't know what side you were on or what the subject was till you stood up. That was hugely valuable. I learned more by doing that for 20 odd years of my life, all right, than anything else, all right? The process created it. As I said at the start of things, somebody puts their ideas forward as in an assertive way, you are fully entitled to hit back in the same way. If they open up a question, they're in query, that's fine. But what you actually see, and I say this is the tyranny of what I call faux mysticism, is they only permit a discourse in which everybody's ideas are equally valuable. And that's I disagree with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, so do I. I just, it's, maybe it is kind of just it's a time compression thing.
It's context as well.
Which you've already responded to.
I mean, I posted something the other day, which was, I decided, well, let's actually talk about these different traditions. All right. So we got Anthro-Complexity, we've got computational complexity, we've got systems thinking. They all have some things in common and some things which are different. So I published something. We said, look, this is what I think is in common. This is what I think is different. That was an open asset to discourse. One of the groups basically said I was talking rubbish and refused to engage in conversation because it threatened their identity. Now, unless you're prepared to have open discussion, and the post I put up today is probably going to cause mayhem with some people. Yeah, because I haven't said they're wrong. I said they're right. They may have been right in one context, but they're no longer right. And this is an open discourse. Now, the trouble is and this is a point I made in the Flowers post, is people's identity is now tied up with their belief systems. So they can't see any attack on what they say as other than an attack on them personally. And that's called the ad hominem argument, right? I have never at any stage in any social media encounter attacked a person. I've attacked the ideas. But the people who do what you say think it's an attack on them personally. And that's the problem. It's an inability to stand back from your own opinion and hear the criticism of it.
Totally. And it's addressing that as one dynamic among many that influences me over the course of a lot of experience of inviting people together so as to open up to what's...
You don't want too many people like me. You want some of us. Well, the ecosystem needs some curmudgeons in it, all right? And it needs some people to do other things. It's complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. I mean, I enjoy speaking with you. I am curious where we would have gotten to if this was.
Well, you need other parties as well. This is 1-to-1. You need more people in it. But it's interesting. I mean, Nora, who I spent a lot of time with. I mean, we agree on most things. she has an ability, and we've had this debate recently, she has an ability to talk to people in their own language by which they love what she says, but then they don't change. I have an ability to irritate the hell out of them. Now, whether they change or not is another matter. We're actually both saying the different things in different languages. And that's why we work quite well in tandem, all right? So starting to create different modes of discourse is important, and different contexts and different roles. And as I say, Triopticon, I think, is one of the best things I've ever invented because it highly ritualizes debate. It goes beyond conventional debating.
Yes, I really like it. I'd actually be motivated to set something up as a public event here and follow the process. Yeah. I remember you speaking about it at the day. I know we don't have any time left. I have enjoyed this conversation. We didn't get into the sort of where process philosophy could maybe situate a little bit of the relationship between mysticism and the continuity of value, or at least modes of orientation across different substrates, which is a big part of an interest of mine. I did leave that there on a number of instances, but you didn't bite on any of that.
I have written
so I am a bit sad about that.
Oh, sorry, you weren't.
Yes, you wrote about it.
Yeah, I think process philosophy was a sort of Hegelian antithesis. It's not the synthesis. I mean, the blog posts I've been writing since Christmas are an invitation to a different type of discourse. I had this, that train in Japan, and I thought, okay, now I'm now starting to see why this stuff is genuinely different, as opposed to just appearing contradictory. And I start to see what's valuable in what's gone in the past and how we get continuity. Today's blog argued that, but I don't think it's going to be taken that way, right? So I think things are starting to open up to a different type of discourse at the moment. I mean, and the good news is that's happening. The bad news is the reason is the recurrence of war and conflict and environmental catastrophe.
Yeah. Right. Well, I want to be respectful of your time.
No, it's always a pleasure.
It's good to talk to you.
Glad you're back in the podcast world. Yeah, you've been missed.